So how and why does money actually matter in political campaigns? Now, whenever I discuss the success and the failures of various politicians and political campaigns, or when I kind of discuss their potential to succeed in upcoming elections, I often mention how much cash that they spend, or they have raised, or maybe that they still have in their campaign bank account. Now, frequently, I get questions or comments in my comment feeds down below oftentimes about why I look at the money, how unfair it is, or related statements saying something similar to that effect. Now, this has happened a bunch recently, like it pretty much does every few years, and I realize I just take some of this stuff for granted. So I realize I should actually produce this video about how and why money matters in political campaigns. So let's just dive in here. Now, before I do, I just want to remind you to hit the like and subscribe button down below. Like and share this video if you like or you hate our content, no matter what. Also, if you know somebody else who could benefit from the videos that we produce, feel free to share this video with them. You can also leave your comment down below if you really think I'm missing something or should produce a video on a related topic in the future, like the one I'm doing right now. So let's get to the discussion of money and political campaign cash, why it matters, and how it is used in the political process. Now, I'm producing this video in Washington State, so I'm going to be using many examples from my home state throughout this video. And if you want to do your own research to actually verify or maybe expand on the work that I've done here, you can actually go to the Washington State Public Disclosure Commission at pdc.wa.gov. And most states have a very similar campaign finance reporting entity where you live. You can actually reference this there. Now, if you're interested in the more federal campaigns, which basically would be anywhere in our country, presidential, congressional, or federal Senate seats being the most common to track, you can go to the Federal Elections Commission at fec.gov to do your own research there. And I'll link to both these resources actually in the video description section down below. Okay, so the first thing to understand about running a political campaign is the basic truth that a politician basically running for office, it's essentially a marketing campaign. It is irrational and unrealistic to believe that just because a politician declares that they're running for public office, that every voter in their district will automatically just know who they are, what they believe, or why they should vote for this guy or gal, kind of like osmosis. The reality is that they have to sell themselves to the public, and this costs money. This is just true whether you're going to be running for local school board or running for president of the United States. Campaigns just cost money. This isn't actually some conspiracy, it's just reality. Signs, posters, banners, ads, brochures, mailers, t-shirts, events, and just all the other services associated with the marketing campaign to promote that candidate, it actually costs money. The vendors just don't give their work or supplies away for free, and while volunteers can often reduce the campaign costs quite substantially, the post office won't send mail for free, and it is illegal for media to give free ad space without declaring it a campaign contribution to the candidate. So the larger the district or the size of the voter population for the targeted political position that a candidate's actually running for, well, the more voters a political campaign needs to reach, and therefore the more it actually costs. Now, money isn't everything, but the size of the political campaign war chest has a huge impact on the inevitable outcome of the political race. And I'll discuss some well-funded campaigns and how they can still screw up, they can squander their cash, and they can fail. And of course, how scrappy, low-dollar campaigns can still succeed later in this video. But as an objective metric determining momentum and success of an average political campaign, the money they raise is a very relevant objective metric to review and understand and, of course, compare with their opposition. And again, there's no conspiracy here in doing so. Now, this might come as a surprise, but in the political process, candidates and politicians, the political campaigns, they mislead, they exaggerate, and they frequently create facades about their political candidates that we often discover later are entirely false. I just hope this statement surprises nobody watching this video. Plus, the reality is that politicians, well, they lie a lot, and we've all seen this. So frequently, the local media, they either promote the lies willfully because they're biased towards one of the political candidates, or they're just sloppy and lazy with their reporting, so they just regurgitate whatever gets shoveled into their inbox. Now, this annoys everyone. And it doesn't matter what political faction you represent, and everyone's frustrated by it. So the challenge for the public and observers is to have some kind of objective metrics by which to measure in some tangible way the success or at least the trends of a political campaign or race as kind of a snapshot in time, or maybe a way to track progress. You can use polls, maybe number of volunteers, how many doors they knocked on, size of their rallies, and other kind of metrics. But these are too easy to exaggerate, spin, or even falsify, and they're just very difficult to vet or verify by independent people who are just outside of the political campaign itself. However, campaign cash raised by the politician's own campaign, this is really an objective metric, and in nearly every state in America, there are legal requirements to report this information accurately, or at least semi-accurately, and this provides the public and outside observers with just a data point by which you can measure the seriousness, the growth, and impact of a political campaign. It certainly isn't a guaranteed path to success, but it is something you can measure. And while not perfect, it does indicate the likelihood of a campaign, at least, for example, breaking out of a crowded primary, or perhaps getting enough attention to garner enough votes to succeed in replacing an incumbent. There are other factors at play, of course, the benefits of incumbency, partisan affiliation in certain political districts, certainly name recognition for a candidate that might help them, and perhaps a massive volunteer effort that can turn the tide in less well-funded political campaigns. But even with all the other variables out there, generally campaign cash matters quite a bit in most political races. So let's look at some local examples in my state of Washington, and I'll start with just an obvious high-profile race from our recent statewide primary election, which was held on Tuesday, August 6th, a week ago from when I'm filming this video. Now, unfortunately, because our state went down the experimental rabbit hole of all mail-in voting, it takes our state weeks to figure out the final election results because we only have about half the ballots on hand on election day. And then the rest of the ballots trickle in over the next few weeks, depending on the questionable and frequently unreliable U.S. postal system. So in this recent primary election, we had a federal Senate seat up for election with a long-term Democrat, Maria Cantwell, here occupying that spot today. And you can see actually from this recent screen grab of the Federal Election Commission report, there is a huge disparity in campaign cash in this race. There were 12 candidates who originally filed with the FEC to run for this office, and 11 of them were competent enough to file with the Washington State Secretary of State, pay their fee, and then run for office. And when you look at this FEC summary, only 3 campaigns essentially reported any campaign cash raised at all. The other 8 candidates essentially raised $0. So an objective observer of this race would be able to reasonably assess that at least 2 of these candidates are serious about running for this position. One is obviously the incumbent, Democrat Senator Maria Cantwell, with her campaign coffers filled to $11.7 million. You can see that here, right, which she's reportedly spent $5.2 million and has over $7 million she can still spend in the general election in November. Washington State has about 4.8 million registered voters, close to 2 million of whom voted in the primary. So this campaign can still spend a few dollars per prospective voter to then market themselves moving into the general election in November. The only other campaign, according to FEC data, that spent any real cash was Republican challenger Dr. Raul Garcia, who raised just under $600,000 and still reportedly has $168,000 in the political campaign bank. Now, no other candidate raised any real money to market to the 4.8 million mostly unaware voters. So let's see how the recent election results match up with the cash that they raised. And I already showed you this here earlier, but you can see the results right here so far. Keep in mind, Washington State, again, has this jungle top 2 primary, so the top 2 vote getters move on to the November ballot. And this is regardless of party affiliation. Everybody else just gets bounced and they lose at this point. So their campaigns are done. Not surprisingly, shouldn't surprise anybody, the incumbent, Senator Cantwell, reported to receive 57.5% of the vote, and presumably her incumbency status, the $5 million she spent, and her party affiliation helped get her to this result. Dr. Raul Garcia, not surprisingly either, was in second place, with just over 22% of the vote, and then, of course, the rest of the candidates split up the balance of the voters. Everyone from good space guy, a perennial candidate for public office for decades, now, and of course, a couple other Republican candidates with some local following, they were able to split up the remainder of the 20% of the votes. Now, they needed no money to actually do that, but nothing really would surprise any casual election observer with this result that you see right here if you had looked at the FEC campaign finance data in advance. So this primary election result would be predictable, and it looks about what you would expect just looking at the FEC data alone. Now, cash doesn't always guarantee that you win, We saw that actually in 2020 in particular when Michael Bloomberg here spent about $1 billion on politics in America, including a spectacular failure on his own presidential bid, and pretty much wasted every penny. You can waste a lot of cash on politics with nothing to show for it, except your political consultants ending up buying very fancy new mansions for your pain. On a much smaller local scale, we saw current incumbent Democrat Public Lands Commissioner Hillary Franz here squander over $1.1 million on a failed effort to survive the primary for the 6th congressional district race last week. This is actually the federal congressional district on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. The Democrat candidate who actually survived that primary to move on to the general election was incumbent state senator Emily Randall from the 26th legislative district, who actually spent over $700,000 to easily win the top spot with 34.5% of the vote, compared to the floundering campaign of Franz, who only received 24.7% for third place. And of course, Franz became the first loser in this political primary race, despite outspending Randall almost 2-1. Now, Franz also lost to the nearly unfunded campaign of Republican State Senator Drew McEwen from the 35th Legislative District, who only spent $85,000 according to FEC data, and he got about 30%, and he survived the primary now to move on to the general election. By the way, this result is roughly in line with the number of independent polls of this district, which were carried out over the past month before the election. So if money was the only thing that mattered, then Hillary Franz would have won this race, but she didn't. So while money matters, clearly it isn't everything. Now, I know what you might say, because I get these comments all the time. Comments like, why should money matter? It isn't fair. I mean, this only encourages rich people to run for office. And I get it, and I understand your concern, but beyond the need to have money to fund a marketing campaign to promote your political candidate, money or the ability to raise funds has actually other benefits to a political campaign. Now, some people seem to mistake large campaign accounts with the candidate being rich. This is generally not true, particularly at the state and local level of political campaigns. When a rich person funds or mostly funds their own political campaign, that money is usually effectively worth quite a bit less than contributions from people in the district. And let me explain why. Say Bill Gates or Elon Musk, they decide they want to run for office, and they dump a bunch of money into their political marketing campaign, sort of like the billionaire Bloomberg did just a few years ago. Now, this certainly will help them cover the costs of marketing, but this is still no guarantee of results, as we saw with Bloomberg's failed 2020 efforts, and the failure actually of other billionaires in the recent past. So the benefit that politicians actually get from being able to raise contributions from regular people, particularly smaller contributions from a lot of people, is that those individuals who take the time to write a check or send in a payment online, they're actually becoming super fans of the politicians in the process. So typically these donors, they know their contributions a public admission of support, and they're far more likely to spread the word to influence others around them to also get together and vote for that same politician, really if for no other reason than to just justify the fact that they themselves had sent in a campaign contribution to that same politician. Now, studies have actually, that I've seen in the past, seem to support the theory that for every individual who writes a candidate a check, no matter how small, they will often influence another 7 to 10 people to actually go and vote for that same candidate. And remember, a lot of people, they don't spend their life or time tracking politicians or political campaigns. This is particularly true below the level of a presidential race. A shockingly large number of people decide who they will vote for on the day of the election. So what influences them the most and how they make their choices when they don't have a strong opinion already? Well, it's the people they know around them, their neighbors, co-workers, family, and friends. If you are a politician running for local office and you have 100 local people write you checks, normally this would indicate you have 100 local fans who have probably influenced another 1,000 people or more to come and vote for you, some of whom may only vote for you because of that small donor's influence on their decision. Now, when I see new politicians or others get angry when I discuss the importance of money in the political process, they are understandably upset that this is a barrier to entry for newcomers who want to get involved. And they're right, it certainly is. I've actually met hundreds of people who jumped into the political process either just frustrated with the corruption, they're angry about an issue, or sometimes with careful analysis of all the wonkish policy issues. And then they discover that they actually have to run a full-fledged campaign, and a very thoughtful voter's guide statement just isn't enough to actually win the race on its own. Now, often these are great candidates who would do very well if they were elected to that political office. but they're never going to become known to the voters because they don't have the money or widespread support to financially enable a marketing campaign just to get the word out there to the general public who otherwise just won't know who they are. Now, I don't believe that every prospective candidate for political office should abandon the effort because they can't match the fundraising prowess of a political incumbent. But you must have a realistic plan to overcome the challenges that you face, of which fundraising is a very clear indicator. Now listen, I know, I hear the same Cinderella stories we all hear from time to time. The trucker from New Jersey who took out a long-term incumbent on the in the state legislature with less than $200. But we only know these stories because they are so rare and unusual. Their uniqueness is actually why we hear about them. You rarely hear about the other 10,000 local candidates for office that same year who had no money and predictably failed to win the election. Most of the time, politics is about grinding away on thankless tasks and tedious marathons rather than experiencing unlikely miracles. So let's talk about how a candidate with less money actually beats a candidate with more. Scenario number one, and I'm going to use some of these examples here, party affiliation. In 2020, a self-identified libertarian named Anthony Welty was running for the Washington State Insurance Commissioner seat. This was a statewide office. He was running a good, solid, early race, traveling around the state and promoting his campaign at events and functions. I saw him frequently. He was honing his message, spoke well in public, had a campaign platform, and was received positively everywhere I saw him. He actually had signs, a website, a good platform, literature, and pretty much everything that you would expect for a normal political campaign. He raised the most for that office in the state primary that very same year. And as you can see from this Public Disclosure Commission report, he raised $87,000. Not enough really to advertise yourself to 4 million voters, but better than the 20-year incumbent Democrat and far more than the last-minute oddball Republican who jumped into the race. That Republican was a clueless young guy named Patel. Now, I supported Welty that year, and so did many other political insiders who actually knew the candidates. But it didn't matter. Welty, despite having a real campaign, decent funding for a position that gets very little attention, and starting early, Welty got smoked in the primary election with only 13% of the vote. And the unfunded, completely unqualified, and unprepared Republican Patel, with no money or a campaign, he moved on to the general election with the 27% of the vote. Now, obviously, Patel got crushed in the general election with the 34% shellacking. And Welty only lost in the primary because in a jungle primary option, a Republican ran against him. And very few people look past party affiliation of the candidates, particularly on a relatively obscure election like this one. So it isn't fair. But this is an example where money just didn't matter in this example for a statewide political race. Scenario number two. Now, this is where an incumbent or a financial leader in a political contest just squanders their campaign cash on dumb stuff, usually consultants. And this is something I see every year, both for Democrats and Republican candidates. It's actually a common disease, particularly if the candidates are lazy or essentially unaware of how the political process works. Even when a candidate is good at fundraising and they raise far more cash than their opponents, sometimes they're just ignorant about how that money's spent, or they think that it's appropriate to spend all the campaign cash on their consultants or maybe cool fundraising parties. Now, just a hint here, if the campaign spends the majority of their cash on consultants and not directly in voter contact efforts, it's essentially a wasted campaign cash pile, basically doing nothing to impact the outcome of the election. Although the candidate might help out the consultant's children go through college, the candidate might as well not have raised any money at all in the first place. A classic example of this was the 2016 Washington State Treasurer race. Now, at the time, in the primary election, the Democrats made an epic fail, and they ran too many candidates who split the vote and ensured that the two Republican candidates in that race became the top two vote getters, which is an example of how the jungle primary system can produce unanticipated general election contests. Now, essentially, we had two Republicans here running against each other. So there was no partisan affiliation advantage for either one of them. And neither one was an incumbent. They were both new to this political position, running for the state treasurer. The best funded campaign in the general election by roughly 300% was Michael Waite, down there at the bottom, from King County, who raised and spent $183,000. The other Republican was an Eastern Washington resident from the rural side of the state, Benton County Auditor Dwayne Davidson, who raised less than $60,000 in cash, and despite the fundraising disparity, easily defeated Waite in the general election. And this happened actually a 58% to 41% result. Now, if the Wait campaign had spent their money more effectively on voter contact rather than almost entirely on consultant payments for cool meetings and messaging that nobody ever actually saw, could they have changed the outcome? We'll never know. But their incompetence with how they did spend their campaign cash, almost exclusively on consultants, ensured that their general election opponent, Dwayne Davidson, had a much easier path to victory. The 300% advantage in campaign cash was no advantage in this case at all. Scenario number 3, and this is where an unpopular train wreck of an incumbent is just so bad that there is no amount of cash that's going to save them. This can also apply to extensive kind of scandals that the media maybe hypes up pre-election. I've seen this a few times over the years, and so have you. This is where you have an incumbent who is perhaps very well funded but can't save himself no matter how much money they throw at the race. Examples of this would be, and I'm just going to use this one off the top of my head because I saw it firsthand, the 2010 campaign where longtime incumbent Thomas Campbell in the 2nd Legislative District, which is part of Thurston County, not far from where I live, while nominally claiming to be a Republican, had been spending his time in office attacking the Republican platform and insulting the grassroots in his Republican district for many years. He was actually originally elected as a Democrat before he just claimed he was a Republican and switched when it was convenient back in 1995. But he even caucused with the Democrats in Olympia past that point in time, just almost on every policy decision, despite his conversion. Now, when challenger Republican J.T. Wilcox stepped up to take him on in 2010, it was a brutal and expensive race for that district, with Wilcox trying to match the spending of the Campbell campaign, but more significantly, easily defeating Campbell in the general election despite hundreds of thousands of additional dollars in outside union PAC and attack ads that were directed at Wilcox and in support of Campbell. So despite this campaign fundraising disparity, when you actually include outside PACs and union attack ads, Wilcox clearly prevailed 60 to 40%. Now, the Wilcox campaign, they weren't barely funded, and they did a good job raising cash at the time, but they barely got close to the funding of a longtime incumbent with extensive outside cash in supporting him, and the Wilcox campaign prevailed decisively anyway. Now, the incumbent Campbell had lost touch with his district, and no campaign bank account could change the inevitable outcome here. It wouldn't have mattered how much money he spent. A similar race happened actually a couple years later in 2014, the Thurston County Commissioner race where I live, where incumbent Democrat Karen Valenzuela was decisively defeated by newcomer challenger Bud Blake, who barely matched the fundraising of incumbent Valenzuela, but was still able to defeat the incumbent very handily. There are plenty of other examples like this around the state and the nation. This is not common, but it does happen. And out of the hundreds of local races on the ballot every election cycle, there's usually just a few examples that you'll find just like this. Now, scenario number 4, it's the last one I'm going to cover. This I would consider the least common, but this is where a political challenger has such an extensive background and support network of people in the community that they can hit the ground running with hundreds of instant local volunteers and supporters, far in excess of their opponents, even incumbents. Now, for those very same positions, that's actually a pretty big deal. And again, this is very uncommon. A potential candidate for office at any level above school board would need to be able to quickly organize often hundreds of volunteers and activists willing to dedicate months of their evenings and time to basically help get that candidate elected. And this is a very rare situation. And it would most likely be the type of scenario you could expect to see from somebody with a large following, like maybe a reality TV show or some other career path that has generated goodwill and a strong public following from many thousands of people in the district. Now, keep in mind, having been involved in helping hundreds of people run for office in the past and having volunteered to run for office myself as well, I can tell you that if you are considering running for office, you will have many, many people encourage you to do so, often calling you and asking you to run. And then once you jump in the race, however, most of these people will disappear and you'll be left with only a handful who actually show up and help with any degree of regularity. This is normal. In order to prevail, particularly over a well-funded incumbent using his background, you genuinely have to be able to motivate significantly large numbers of people to show up and dedicate themselves to your campaign all the way through. This is exceedingly rare, but it can theoretically happen. So to sum this video up, money matters in politics. It isn't everything, but it is an objective measure of how serious a campaign is at winning, how capable they are at communicating, and how much they plan to dedicate themselves to reaching and marketing to the politician, to the public, who they're asking to vote for them. It is a messy, chaotic, and uncertain process. The lies, the deception, the spin, the exaggerations, and the biases are everywhere, and it's very hard for most people to see through the haze and fog of politics and see what's really happening right there. So tracking political campaigns' bank accounts and their financial spending becomes one of the objective metrics. Most of us who try to pay attention to the political process, this is what we use. It's logical for us to use it and compare. And it isn't the only thing that matters, but a candidate running for Congress without any money in their bank account is really not considered a serious candidate at all. A candidate that plans to challenge a well-funded state legislator who has $250,000 in their coffers, but the challenger only has $5,000, well, that's just not very serious in most cases either. This is not irrational, it's not a conspiracy, and nor is it illogical. It just makes sense. So I hope this video helps explain why money matters in the political process. And I hope this helps you, my viewer, understand that money represents more than just a big bank account, but it represents the ability to market a politician to their voters, and people who write checks to their favorite politicians often become super fans of them, and this can help spread the word even more than their campaign check does itself. Now finally, money isn't everything. There are some scenarios where anemically funded campaigns can still succeed, but they're not common. And again, like everything in this world, and the political process in particular, you must show up first to make an impact. And I hope this video helps you be more prepared and more aware next time when you decide to show up, because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.